Hello there and welcome back to War Thunder tutorial review on the USS Atlanta. This ship is quite the opposite of the first ship that I reviewed in this patch, which is the German heavy cruiser, the Admiral Hipper. It is not just amongst the cruisers a very light ship, but even amongst the light cruisers, its armament is questionable. However, the ship also has some strength and obviously also some weaknesses. I want to highlight those strengths and weaknesses, highlight how to use the strength and also how to abuse the weaknesses if you play against this ship. And I also want to run down the statistics on the ship and draw a comparison to its major opponents on the seas of War Thunder. And before we do that, I want to introduce you to a 5-minute guide about the historical career of the ship by the ever awesome Drachinifel. I hope you enjoy.
The Atlanta class started life as the return to a design concept from before the First World War, namely the scout cruiser or destroyer flotilla leader. The basic principle was that of an overgrown destroyer that could keep up with the rest of the flotilla, but by being larger could accommodate a command staff, more powerful signalling equipment, and a heavier armament to give the unit an advantage over an enemy flotilla that might be led by simply a normal destroyer. As a result, the Atlanta class used the same 5-inch 38 caliber gun as many American destroyers, which was also a very good anti-aircraft weapon. But unlike a destroyer, which would have between 4 and 6 guns, usually in single mounts, the design called for no fewer than 16 such weapons, which made them highly effective escort vessels when it came to dealing with enemy aircraft. After the first 4 ships, the Oakland subclass was developed that further optimized the ships away from a surface combat role and more towards the anti-aircraft role. The class comprised 4 ships to the original design: Atlanta, Juno, San Diego, and San Juan. The next 4 were of the Oakland class: Oakland, Reno, Flint, and Tucson. 3 more ships were built later to a modified version of the design, but were sufficiently different to become a separate class. The Atlanta saw heavy action during World War II, collectively earning 54 battle stars. 2 of the class were sunk in action, the Atlanta and Juno, both at the Battle of Guadalcanal. The original armament of the class would consist of 8 twin turrets carrying the 5-inch 38 caliber gun, 3 superfiring forward, 3 superfiring aft, and 1 on each wing. Initially directed by 2 Mark 37 fire control systems, during the war radar and improved fire control systems were fitted, which greatly improved the accuracy and gave them the ability to operate at night. 3 quad 28mm guns completed the loadout, but after a 4th was added it was decided the 28mm or 1.1-inch gun was not effective and they were replaced by twin 40mm Bofors mounts instead. In addition, increasing numbers of 20mm single mounts were added as the war went on, and eventually the ships would carry 12 20mm and 10 40mm guns, which, along with other wartime additions, was beginning to make them unstable from the additional weight of weapons, ammunition, and extra men that were needed to man them all. The Oakland class got rid of the 2 wing turrets, replacing them with twin 40mm guns. This gave the ships 4 less 5-inch guns, but 8 more 40mm and 4 more 20mm. As the kamikaze's attacks escalated towards the end of the war, some of the 20mm guns were replaced by even more 40mm guns to stop the aircraft more effectively at longer ranges. Both classes were built with 2 quad torpedo launchers, 1 on each side, although a number of ships had them removed during the war to minimize the risk of explosion and to add even more anti-aircraft guns. Finally, as if the ships were not coveting quite enough firepower, in 1942 they were also fitted with sonar and depth charge launchers for anti-submarine warfare, although the projectors were quickly removed for, guess again, more anti-aircraft guns. Due to their origin as flotilla leaders, the ships could make just under 34 knots and were lightly protected, with a 3.5-inch belt being the thickest armour present. Although, as you might expect, they were formidable as anti-aircraft ships, the Atlanta-class cruisers didn't tend to fare so well in surface combat. The only 2 cruisers of the class engaged in surface combat were sunk, Atlanta and Juno, which comprised 2/3 of all US Navy light cruiser losses during World War II. Both were sunk during combat in the Guadalcanal campaign, But it was not the unique armament of the Atlanta class that contributed to their loss, but rather the fact that the ship's small size and light armour gave little protection from the torpedoes that sealed their fate. Admittedly, Atlanta being shot up by 8-inch shells from the USS San Francisco by mistake also didn't help. Conversely, in the same battle, the other ships showed their ability in their original role, as they were able to rapidly overwhelm many Japanese destroyers. The sinking of Juno is especially important as it caused a change in American policy. Previously, it had been possible for an entire generation of one family to serve on a single ship. In this case, the 5 Sullivan brothers were aboard. But when the ship was sunk, the explosion was so catastrophic that nearby American ships assumed that there could not possibly be any survivors, and left. In fact, over 100 of the crew survived, but by the time somebody came back to rescue them, only 10 were left. 2 of the Sullivans had actually survived the sinking, but none of them survived long enough to be picked up. As a result, US policy was changed so that at least one sibling must serve on a different ship or in a different unit if all have enlisted, and also, if all but one are killed in action, the remaining serviceman or woman is to be released back home. All 8 ships served in World War II, with 6 of them surviving the war. Atlanta was commissioned in December 1941, just a few weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and would participate as an anti-aircraft cruiser in the decisive American victory at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, before being sent south to fight in the Solomon Islands. Atlanta was eventually scuttled after receiving a torpedo hit and heavy gunfire damage from Japanese surface warships and the aforementioned USS San Francisco in November 1942 at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Juno was also heavily damaged in surface combat in the same battle, and then sunk by the Japanese submarine I-26. Reno was torpedoed off Leyte in November 1944, resulting in a large fire and significant flooding, but was saved from sinking by the damage control efforts of the crew. After the war, the 6 surviving ships in this class were decommissioned between 1947 and 1949, and placed in the reserve fleet, but were ultimately struck and scrapped by 1970.
Let's now talk about the ship in harbor and how its protection fares in War Thunder. Let's begin with the armor and let's begin with the hull. The main armor belt as well as the front and rear bulkhead are 88.9mm thick, while in theory you can angle at longer ranges and so protect your main propulsion system versus armor-piercing shells from destroyers. That's the least of your concern, because the rest of the ship's armor, aside from the conning tower and the fire control systems, which are cladded in 63.5mm, the rest of the ship is covered in less than 32mm plating. The turrets, the barbettes, and also the protection and the deck of the main magazines as well as the citadel. So you have overall 8 turrets, 3 super firing at the front, 3 super firing at the back, and 1 on each wing, giving you a maximum broadside of 14 guns, and that is quite substantial. We also have some central torpedoes with decent firing angles. The firing angles, the gun handling, and also the elevation and depression of the main turrets are also excellent. So the handling of the guns is very good, the protection is very bad. Furthermore, if you look at the X-ray, we can see that the entire front of the ship is covered in fuel tanks, and then while the main magazines of the front turrets are just below the waterline, the rear ones are at the waterline, and as we just saw, 32mm is all that protects them. So an unlucky HE shell, even from a destroyer in some cases, especially base use HE, can blow up the entirety of the ship. So you are pretty fragile. Furthermore, since only the middle section of the ship's hull is protected at all, you take massive damage from HE shells just hitting the hull, and you lose a substantial amount of crew. So when you get shot, you're in this endless repair cycle of repairing gun systems, and also getting control back of your ship, extinguishing fire, and stopping flooding, as well as pumping out the water. That is a severe drawback of the ship. It is highly fragile, and if you're unlucky and you get caught off guard, even a destroyer can inflict serious damage very quickly to you. Let's now put the ship into perspective with its main competitors on the Waves of War Thunder, and we can see that we have the most amount of guns, 16 127mm. That's the lowest caliber in this comparison, although not by much, to the Drachinifel and the HMS Dido. And we have overall a ridiculous amount of ammunition, 7,200, so you never run out of shells despite your extremely high rate of fire. Every 3 seconds a 14 shell salvo goes out, resulting in a DPM, or shells in the air, of 280, dwarfing the rest of the competition. None comes even close, not even the HMS Dido comes to half of that. So that you can see that you can spam shells all over the place, and this is very, very good versus aircraft. This is very good versus destroyers, patrol boats, etc., especially at close range in combination with your excellent gun handling. To get in this position, that's the trick. And you also have to rely sometimes on your torpedoes. If you have to avoid an enemy cruiser around an island, you can deploy some mobile mines. With those Mark 15 torpedoes, you have 4 on each side, 1 quadruple launcher, 533mm of average caliber, and they have a maximum range at 9,150 meters, and that at a speed of 62 kilometers per hour. That is not the slowest here in the comparison with the torpedo mod, but the range is actually the lowest, and obviously the performance is far away from the long lances of the Japanese, but it doesn't even come close in terms of range to the Germans with the torpedo mode of the G7A. However, the ship has actually a fairly substantial displacement of 8,473 tons, being actually the heaviest cruiser in this comparison, which comes at a surprise if you look at the Drachinifel, which has overall protection. However, that cruiser has to pay quite a bit with the speed, because the rest of the cruisers go 60 to 65 kilometers per hour, so that makes the USS Atlanta fairly average, and so you are another speed demon. And especially in turns, due to the long shape of the hull, which is quite narrow, it doesn't turn very well. So it's quite surprising how sluggish this thing is in a turn. The crew with 623 is also not the highest, it is in fact the second lowest. That means your crew losses are quite severe when it comes to manning the guns, etc, etc, and as I said, you lose a substantial amount even to high explosive shells, whereas other cruisers have the majority of the crew protected in the main citadel. This ship doesn't have this comfort. So the ship is quite literally a short-range DPM glass cannon, and this is amplified here by the gun statistics. Let's now have a look at the effectiveness of the business end of the USS Atlanta. Now let's have a look at the ammunition. The ship gets access to 3 different shell types. The first shell type is the stock HE, the 127mm AAC Mark 34. It has a rather low muzzle velocity of 792 meters per second, carries a 3.22 kilogram heavy TNT filler, and has a maximum penetration of 54mm in the kinetic effect and 36mm of pure blast penetration. This shell is not very good against cruisers, especially also at long range, where the single shell has a very slim chance of hitting. While you can spam it and hope for the best and try to annoy the enemy and knocking out modules here and there, versus a cruiser that has some degree of protection, the shell doesn't do all that much. But versus destroyers, the sheer DPM combined with the still decent TNT filler of the stock HE shell means that you are melting destroyers like there is no tomorrow, especially at close quarters. So this is where the ship could excel. As a second option, you could fire the 127mm Common Mark 32. This is a semi-armor piercing shell. It has the same rather slow muzzle velocity of only 792 meters per second and carries not the greatest TNT filler of 1.15 kilograms. In this department, it really falls off versus its cruiser competition, not just in raw penetration of only 125 millimeters and also at 10 kilometers it's only 38 millimeters, but also the TNT equivalent doesn't do all the greatest post-penetration damage. Again, it is the huge amount of shells that you throw at the enemy. You can lob the shells over islands that other cruisers really can't in the same way. And you always can hope for the freak shell, the lucky shot that disables a gun turret, that hits the torpedo tubes and or at some point goes just simply through the armor by finding a armor gap hole and then finds the way to the main magazine. So this shell isn't really all that great, but the sheer amount of them, and in particular versus armored destroyers and also versus ships that go bow in, is actually not that terrible. The single shell isn't all that great, but in combination with the huge DPM, it still does the job. And I have destroyed Admiral Hippers, I've destroyed German cruisers, British and Japanese cruisers alike with no problem. The third shell type is practically the stock HE shell, just with a proximity fuse, and that is very, very good versus aircraft. So you can mark an enemy aircraft and then actually enjoy the firework when you go back to your secondaries and the automatic gunners just flood the sky with shells. So this is where the Atlanta is merely untouchable for aircraft if no islands are nearby where an aircraft can mask its approach. And also, since it has the same damage effect and also the same TNT filler, the same muzzle velocity, there is no harm in swapping out the stock HE shell for this, since you have to decide for only 2 shell types when going into battle. So I would take this shell type as your primary shell for farming and melting destroyers, for hunting down patrol boats, and also flooding the sky with the proximity fuse shells in anti-aircraft defense fire. And then if you come across a more sturdy target, then switch to the semi-armor piercing and just flood it, knock out the gun turrets, and just try to go with your team and not to single-handedly try to solo an enemy cruiser, because that's not gonna work in most cases. Now we have talked about quite a few statistics, but what does this mean how to play the ship? Well, the first thing that you need to do when you come across the right map and the right spawn, if you will, is to hold your fire. Do not engage the enemy cruisers at long range. The damage that you inflict is minimal, but you only attract attention, so people are starting to fire at you because you're not just posing a little bit of a threat at the end of the day, but you're also a quick and easy kill to just justify the repair costs. You have to ambush people like I just did here with this Nürnberg. I switched to semi-armor piercing, and the first semi-armor piercing salvo knocks out both rear turrets, and then I aim for the front turret, and also with the third salvo knock it out of action. So now I just can harass the ship in its entirety. There is not much that he can do. Yes, I lose a turret to one of the Nürnberg secondaries. I adjust the range, and so many shells, one of them is bypassing the turtleback armor array and finds the ammo storage, giving me a cruiser kill. This ship is very much an ambush predator, but it also requires a captain that has a lot of situational awareness, how the situation around him changes. While you can spend the entirety of the day just tunnel visioning in your aiming scope and just harass an enemy occupied cruiser, you still have to look around and come across those patrol boats, and you can just see how fast I swing those gun turrets around and how easy I eliminate here one of the patrol boats. And then just a few seconds later, there is one of the hard hitters in this game, the big boy, the Kirov. I have some torpedoes to at least get some revenge kill if he manages to kill me, but again, his turrets are weakly armored, so there is a chance that I can knock them out. I risk it here again versus another patrol boat, but again, even at a short distance of 3 kilometers, the rather slow muzzle velocity shows, so you have to give quite a bit of lead and hope for the best. And again, the handling of the ship, acceleration, braking, top speed, and also the turning capabilities are not the best. Again, very short range ambush predator, but a rather sluggish one. It's the guns that are very frantic in turning and firing. So here I'm just looking, and oh boy, there is the Kirov. Again, I spotted him, and I knock out his guns before he actually can swing them around. And yeah, the rear turret, come on, let's knock it out. And I found actually one of the secondary ammo racks, and that gave me the kill on a Kirov. But even if it wouldn't have been for that lucky shot, with the next solo I would have knocked out the rear turret. And the Kirov secondaries, they are nothing to scoff at, but versus my firepower, I think I would have won that fight anyways. And you could see I'm still healthy, and even if one of those guys, or multiple of them, would come after me in patrol boats or in planes, unlike some other cruisers that are very good in gunfights, for example the Japanese with their high caliber guns, with their 8-inch guns, or the Admiral Hipper, or the Nürnberg, or the Köln, I have very, very good anti-aircraft capabilities. The problem with those anti-aircraft capabilities is that they are not secondaries but your main guns. So you have to remember this, and huge shout out to this guy who actually wanted to destroy the torpedoes before they would have been a threat to me. And this is just so beautiful when I see this in a game, and thanks for the effort. I mean, it was not necessary. I dodged those torpedoes by braking and reversing, but it's the spirit that counts. And with team members like these, you only can win. I just wanted to point this out. Again, just in a nutshell, before we come to the end of the video, don't fight with other cruisers, ambush enemy destroyers, and maybe even cruisers. Shoot at cruisers that are preoccupied if you have to, but you have to really focus around the cap. You have to play around cover. You have to be the anti-aircraft screen for your team. You can switch to your 28mm secondaries and let the autogunners do the hard work for you, which is always a pretty sign. And a pretty sight for you. It is a bit of an abusive game mechanic, but this is what we have here in War Thunder, and I have to say that this ship can be immensely fun, but it also can be immensely frustrating if you if you come across the wrong map and the wrong game mode where it's cruiser fights only. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a like, give it, subscribe if you want to see more, and also use the link in the video description down below to Drachinifel's YouTube channel. And we'll see each other in the skies, on the battlefields, and on the waves of War Thunder.